The Cold War, a conflict between two superpowers that never turned hot but shaped global history for nearly half a century. From post-World War II tensions to near-nuclear war to the rise and fall of the Berlin Wall, the Cold War defined international relations, military strategies, and ideological battles. Join us as we explore the key events that shaped this geopolitical struggle in From Tensions to Transformation, the timeline of the Cold War. The Cold War began in the aftermath of World War II. As the war was coming to a conclusion, two conferences were held in 1945. The first, between February 4th and 11th, the Yalta Conference, took place in Crimea. Allied leaders Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin met to agree on how to end the war and reorganize Europe. This was followed by the Potsdam Conference in Germany, held between July 17th and August 2nd, 1945. Leaders Churchill, then replaced by new Prime Minister Clement Attlee, met with U.S. President Harry Truman and Soviet leader Stalin to continue their discussions on the future of Europe. However, even with Nazi Germany defeated, the ideological divide between the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union, became impossible to ignore. There was a deep distrust between the two superpowers, with Stalin determined to expand Soviet influence across Eastern Europe. In 1946, Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech, warning of Soviet domination. A year later, in 1947, President Truman's Truman Doctrine signaled America's commitment to containing communism, marking the official beginning of the Cold War. This policy led to increased U.S. involvement in global conflicts and reshaped international politics for decades. To rebuild war-torn Europe and prevent the spread of communism, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall announced the ERP, the European Recovery Program, on June 5, 1947. Nicknamed the Marshall Plan, it set out to provide billions of dollars in aid to Western Europe. The Soviet Union, however, saw this as an act of Western expansion and countered with tighter control over Eastern Europe. Countries that fell under Soviet influence were forced to reject American assistance, solidifying the East-West divide. On June 24, 1948, the first major crisis of the Cold War erupted when the Soviets blocked all land routes into West Berlin in an attempt to force the Allies out. The US and Britain responded with the Berlin Airlift, lasting between June 1948 and May 1949, supplying the city with approximately 2 million tons of food and fuel. Stalin eventually lifted the blockade, but the division of Germany into East and West was cemented. This event reinforced the idea that neither side was willing to back down, setting the stage for decades of rivalry. On April 4, 1949, the U.S. and its allies formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance to counter Soviet aggression. That same year, the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear bomb, codenamed Joe 1 by the U.S., escalating fears of mutual destruction. The world was now locked in an arms race where both superpowers developed massive stockpiles of nuclear weapons, each capable of devastating destruction. The Soviets responded to NATO by creating the Warsaw Pact on May 14, 1955. It was a military alliance of communist states across Eastern Europe. This solidified the divide between the two opposing blocs and intensified the arms race, pushing the world closer to nuclear confrontation. The concept of mutually assured destruction became the backbone of Cold War military strategy, as both sides understood that full-scale war could mean the end of civilization as they knew it. The Cold War turned deadly with the outbreak of the Korean War. On June 25, 1950, Communist North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea, prompting a US-led United Nations intervention. After 3 years of brutal conflict and an estimated death toll of 2.5 million, an armistice was signed on the 27th of July 1953, leaving Korea divided along the 38th parallel, a line of latitude that runs through East Asia, a division that remains to this day. The war demonstrated how Cold War tensions could escalate into full-scale military conflicts. Meanwhile, in the US, anti-communist hysteria peaked with McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy led aggressive campaigns against suspected communists, blacklisting many and deepening domestic fears of Soviet infiltration. The era saw Hollywood actors, government officials, and intellectuals accused of disloyalty, fostering a climate of paranoia. As the Cold War intensified, espionage became a crucial battlefield. One of the most infamous spy rings was the Cambridge Five, British double agents who secretly passed classified intelligence to the Soviet Union. Recruited during their university years in the 1930s, members such as Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, and Anthony Blunt infiltrated British and American intelligence agencies. Their actions compromised Western operations for years, revealing crucial secrets about nuclear programs and diplomatic strategies. The exposure of the Cambridge spies in the early 1950s shocked the West and heightened fears of Soviet infiltration. It reinforced Cold War paranoia, particularly in the United States, where the era of McCarthyism was already in full swing. The scandal not only embarrassed Britain, but also demonstrated how deeply Soviet intelligence had penetrated Western institutions. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite marking the start of the space race. The US responded by forming NASA on July 29, 1958, and accelerating their own space exploration efforts. Space became another battleground for Cold War supremacy, leading to rapid technological advancements. The subsequent years witnessed numerous space missions, ultimately culminating in humanity's achievement of landing on the moon. As tensions between the East and West escalated, Berlin became the front line of the Cold War. Since the division of Germany, thousands of East Germans had been fleeing to the West through Berlin, weakening the Eastern Bloc. To stop this exodus, the Soviet-backed East German government erected the Berlin Wall on August 13, 1961. Overnight, families were separated and strict border controls were enforced. The wall became the defining symbol of Cold War division, representing the ideological and physical barrier between communist and capitalist worlds. For nearly 3 decades, it stood as a reminder of the global struggle between the two superpowers. Tensions almost turned deadly with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The US discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, leading to a 13-day standoff between October 16 and 28, 1962. While the world held its breath, President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Prime Minister Nikita Khrushchev were locked in talks to try and de-escalate the situation. The crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war before the Soviets agreed to withdraw their missiles in exchange for a US pledge not to invade Cuba. A secret agreement also led to the removal of American missiles from Turkey. This event highlighted the dangers of nuclear escalation and led to increased diplomacy between the superpowers. The Cold War took a devastating turn with the Vietnam War. The war, which had originally started in 1955, saw the US intervene to prevent South Vietnam from falling to communism. American troops were deployed in 1965, leading to years of bloody conflict. However, rising anti-war protests in America and the high cost of war led to the US signing the Paris Peace Accords on January 27, 1973, and agreeing to withdraw their soldiers. April 30, 1975 saw the fall of Saigon, marking a major Cold War setback for the West as the Communist North took control of the country. Meanwhile, a period of détente, easing tensions, began in the 1970s. US President Richard Nixon visited China and the Soviet Union, leading to arms control agreements like the SALT treaties, the Strategic Arms Limitation talks. However, détente was short-lived as another war would soon ignite tensions. On December 24, 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, seeking to enforce the Brezhnev Doctrine, which stated that socialist countries should support other socialist countries, even using force if necessary. The Soviets looked to support Afghan leader Babrak Karmal and its communist government against insurgents. The US, seeing an opportunity to weaken the Soviets, aided the Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen. They provided weapons and training whilst the CIA ran propaganda operations. Like the Vietnam War had done to the US, the Afghan War did to the USSR. It lasted 10 years, drained resource and morale, and cost billions, while the death toll of Afghans reached millions. The long-term consequences of the United States intervention would have global implications, as radical Islamist groups later emerged from the conflict. The Cold War's final chapter began in 1989, when on November 9th, the Berlin Wall fell, symbolizing the collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost and perestroika, which translates to openness and restructuring, led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, in turn bringing an era of freedom of press and political expression to the region. For nearly half a century, the Cold War defined global politics, reshaped societies, and brought the world dangerously close to nuclear catastrophe. While the Cold War ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, its legacy remains. The arms race led to the vast nuclear arsenals that still exist today. Cold War-era alliances like NATO continue to shape international relations, and many of the political tensions, regional conflicts, and ideological divisions of the 20th century still influence global affairs today. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more historical timelines. Thanks for watching. Until next time.